Logan Carter stood in the very middle of a dusty salvage yard, his hand resting on a corroded engine block that everyone else had written off as worthless scrap metal. Amelia Brooks laughed right in front of the crowd. She told him he never changed, always wasting money on useless things, just like his life. The crowd laughed with her. Logan said nothing. He paid a few $100s and hauled the dead engine back to his small garage. But 3 weeks later, a racing legend arrived at his door. And with just one look at that engine, everything changed. Was Logan holding a pile of worthless junk, or the greatest discovery of his life? Stay until the very end. The town of Millhaven, Kentucky, sat quietly between two ridges of old-growth timber, a place where ambition tended to arrive young and leave fast, and where the people who stayed behind learned to make peace with the gap between what they had imagined and what they had become. Logan Carter was 34 years old and ran a one-bay garage on the corner of Elm and 4th. A modest operation with a hand-painted sign, 2 hydraulic lifts, and a perpetual smell of motor oil baked into the concrete floor. He was the kind of mechanic who could diagnose a transmission problem by sound alone, who could feel through a wrench when a bolt was 2 turns from stripped, but his reputation in town had curdled from quiet respect into something closer to pity. His schedule was thin most weeks, filled mostly with oil changes and busted exhaust pipes, work that paid just enough to keep the lights on. Most of the locals saw what they expected to see: a man with no forward motion, too old to start over and too stubborn to admit it. But Logan Carter had not always lived in the margins of Millhaven. In his mid-20s, he had held a position at a regional automotive engineering firm in Louisville, doing load stress analysis on prototype engine mounts, and his supervisor had been quietly grooming him for a senior mechanical engineering role that would have doubled his salary and pulled him into the orbit of real professional recognition. He had been engaged to Amelia Brooks, a woman he had loved with the uncomplicated conviction of someone who had not yet learned how quickly circumstances can unmoor a relationship. He had a future then, at least in the way that phrase is understood by people who still believe their plans are more permanent than circumstances. Then his father, Raymond Carter, was diagnosed with a degenerative neurological condition that accelerated faster than the doctors initially projected, and Logan made a decision that required no deliberation at all. He left Louisville, gave up the engineering role, and came back to Millhaven to manage his father's care full-time. The sacrifice was total and largely invisible to everyone around him. He had sold his equipment, surrendered his apartment, and walked away from the career ladder without looking back. Raymond Carter had been an exceptional mechanic in his prime, a man who had rebuilt engines in a small shop on Route 9 for 30 years, and Logan had inherited both the garage and his father's extraordinary instinct for the work. For nearly 4 years, he drove his father to appointments, managed medications, kept the garage running enough to cover medical bills, and accepted the gradual narrowing of his world without complaint. Amelia had stayed at first, but patience is not the same as commitment, and sometime in the 2nd year, she had begun to look at him with an expression he recognized, but could not name, something between disappointment and restlessness, as if she was watching a man choose to shrink. She left him on a Tuesday evening in October, cleanly and without cruelty, and told him she needed someone who was building something. Raymond Carter died 14 months later, and Logan buried him on a gray afternoon with 4 people in attendance. He kept the garage, the tools, and the habits his father had given him, one of which was the practice of walking through salvage yards on slow weekends, lifting corroded castings, examining worn valve housings, and listening to the way metal spoke when it had once been made with intention. Logan collected parts the way some people collect memories, not for profit, not for any clear purpose, but because he had learned that things overlooked often contained more history than things displayed. The town thought it strange. Some said he was chasing his father's ghost. Most simply stopped wondering about him at all. It was a Thursday morning in early March when Ryan Foster called him. "Got a new batch in from an estate down in Harlan County," Ryan said, his voice carrying the enthusiasm of a man who sold everything by weight and found all of it equally interesting. "Whole truck of old engine components. If you want to dig through before I crush it, come now." Logan hung up the phone, locked the garage, and drove to the salvage yard without stopping for breakfast. Ryan Foster's salvage yard occupied 4 acres on the eastern edge of town, a place that looked, from the highway, like organized chaos and looked, up close, like the chaos had won. Rows of stripped car bodies sat in lines of descending condition, their chrome long oxidized to gray, their interiors consumed by years of weather and neglect. Flattened radiators were stacked beside rusted drive shafts and cracked intake manifolds, and the whole yard carried a particular smell: old petroleum mixed with rust and something faintly sweet, like decomposing rubber, that Logan found more comforting than most people would have understood. He moved through the rows with the deliberate calm of someone who was not in a hurry, his eyes tracking the shapes of things the way a trained eye reads a page, absorbing detail without pausing. He found the new delivery stacked near the back gate, mostly what he had expected: domestic V8 components from the 1970s and early 80s. Common castings, mass-market hardware, the kind of machinery built for reliability rather than distinction. He worked through the pile methodically, setting aside a few pieces worth cleaning, until his hand touched something beneath a tangle of coolant hoses that made him stop. The block was smaller than most of what surrounded it, and it had a geometry that did not conform to any production line he could immediately place. He pulled it free and set it upright on a flattened piece of cardboard. And then he simply looked at it for a long moment, without touching anything else. The casting itself was partially obscured by decades of grime and hardened oil. But the underlying material was wrong. Wrong in the way that interesting things are wrong, meaning it was more refined than it had any business being in this pile. The fin geometry on the cylinder head was unconventional, the port angles too aggressive for a street application, and the overall proportions had the tightened, purposeful quality that Logan associated with purpose-built competition machinery rather than anything designed to move commuters. A serial identifier had been stamped into the block near the bell housing mount. But years of oxidation and what appeared to be deliberate grinding had reduced it to an almost unreadable groove. Almost. He pulled a rag from his back pocket, wiped the surface with careful pressure, and studied the shadow left in the metal. Ryan came around the corner with his hands in his jacket pockets, watching Logan with the mild curiosity of a man who had seen collectors behave strangely his entire adult life and was no longer capable of surprise. "That pile's been sitting in a barn for God knows how long," Ryan said. "Part of a bigger Hall estate sale down south. Nobody wanted that piece. Wrong bolt pattern for anything common. Too small for most rebuilds." He shrugged. "Junk, as far as I can tell." Logan didn't answer. He was turning the block carefully in both hands, noting the machined tolerances at the oil gallery passages, the way the intake port geometry had been blended by hand rather than cast in a production mold, the presence of an unusual secondary boss on the driver's side that served no immediately obvious function. That was when he heard them. A late-model German sedan had pulled into the lot, and a group of 3 or 4 people climbed out well-dressed against the gray morning chill, picking their way around the puddles with the performative care of people who find certain locations slightly beneath them. Logan recognized Amelia Brooks before she recognized him, which gave him a fraction of a second to decide what his face would do, and he decided on nothing at all. She was with 2 women and a man he didn't know, and she wore the composed, easy expression of someone who has built a life on forward motion and stopped looking backward long ago. She saw Logan and her expression shifted only slightly: recognition, then something that flickered too quickly to name, then the smooth social recovery that followed. She walked toward him with relaxed authority, glancing at the engine block resting on the cardboard beside his feet. "Logan," she said. Her voice was the same. "Still doing this?" It wasn't quite a question. He looked at her steadily. "Still doing this," he confirmed. She looked down at the block with the expression of someone evaluating evidence in support of a conclusion already reached, then back at him with something that wasn't quite pity and wasn't quite amusement, but occupied the uncomfortable space between them. "You're buying a dead engine," she said. "In a junkyard. On a Thursday morning." She let the sentence settle. Some things don't change, I guess. One of the women behind her made a sound that belonged to laughter. The man smiled at his shoes. "Throwing good money after bad," Amelia added, quieter. "Like you always did, just like every choice you've ever made, Logan." Logan reached into his jacket and pulled out 4 folded bills. He handed them to Ryan without answering, lifted the engine block with both hands, and walked toward his truck. The laughter behind him was brief and self-congratulatory. He placed the block carefully in the truck bed, secured it with a ratchet tie-down, and drove away from the salvage yard the way he had arrived, without hurry and without theater. Back in his garage, Logan set the engine block on a workstand and began the process he had repeated hundreds of times. Though never with quite this level of focused attention, he started with solvent and a natural bristle brush, working from the valve cover surface down through the cylinder bores, dissolving 40 years of oxidized oil into brown rivers that ran off the block and pooled on the drain mat below. He worked in silence, the way his father had taught him, without music, without distraction, because sound carries information in a shop, and you lose that information the moment you fill the air with something else. The garage was cold enough that he could see his breath on the worst gusts coming through the gap under the roll-up door. But he didn't notice. He was listening to the metal. What emerged from beneath the grime over the next 3 hours was not what he had expected, even with the initial impressions from the salvage yard. The alloy composition of the block was unusual. He tested it with a magnet and a chemical spot kit from the back cabinet, and the results suggested a proprietary aluminum-silicon blend not used in mainstream production at any point in his working memory. The casting quality was extraordinary, and under a magnifying glass, the mating surfaces were machined to tolerances normally associated with aerospace applications. The combustion chamber geometry, once he had cleaned the head sufficiently to see it clearly, was asymmetric, in a way that screamed deliberate aerodynamic optimization, rather than cost-effective manufacturing. This was not a commuter engine. Whoever had designed this block had been solving a specific problem at the edge of what was technically possible, and they had done it by hand. He found the first anomaly on the second day. Beneath the intake manifold flange, obscured by a thin layer of hardened sealant compound, was a secondary stamp applied with a different dye than the primary identification groove. He removed the sealant carefully with a precision pick and a jeweler's loop. And what appeared beneath it was a partial alphanumeric sequence. 8 characters, 4 fully legible, that matched nothing in his immediate reference library. He wrote it down in the small notebook he kept on the workbench beside his coffee mug, where every interesting vehicle identification had been recorded for the past 12 years. Logan's bookshelves at the back of the garage held more technical manuals and motorsport histories than most public libraries carried. That evening, he pulled 3 volumes on competition engine development from the period between 1955 and 1980, cross-referenced the partial code against every documented racing program he could locate, and found nothing that matched precisely, but found something that made him sit forward in his chair. There was a reference in the second volume, buried in a footnote on page 311, to a secret volume American racing program that had operated briefly in the late 1960s under a consortium of manufacturers and independent engineers, developing a turbocharged flat-plane crankshaft engine platform specifically for closed-course endurance competition. The program had been abruptly shuttered following a catastrophic fire at a test facility in 1971, and all prototype hardware had been classified as destroyed. Logan sat back and stared at the ceiling for a moment. Then at the notebook. Then at the engine. He worked through most of the night, and by 3 in the morning he had located and cleaned a third identification marker, this one stamped into the underside of the crankcase skirt, a location so counterintuitive that it would have been invisible to anyone not specifically looking for it. He copied the fully intact sequence into his notebook letter by letter, then sat very still at the workbench, with both hands wrapped around a cold coffee mug, and the overhead light casting hard shadows across the engine block. He remembered his father sitting in this same garage on a winter evening years ago. Raymond saying in that careful, unhurried voice he used when he was teaching something important, "Don't ever let another man tell you what something's worth before you understand it yourself." Most people give up the second it gets hard to read. Logan had been 19 years old then and had not fully understood the instruction. He understood it now. He didn't sleep that night. He opened 3 more reference volumes, sent 4 emails to automotive archivists he had corresponded with over the years, and by sunrise, he had assembled enough corroborating material that the possibility he was most afraid to believe had moved from improbable to terrifying. He stood in the middle of the garage in the gray early morning light, looking at the engine block on the stand, and understood that he needed outside verification not because he doubted himself, but because what he suspected was too significant to carry alone. Logan spent 3 more days building a file the way he built everything methodically and without shortcuts. He printed the reference documents, annotated them in red pen, created a cross-comparison table, mapping the dimensional specifications of his engine block against every documented racing prototype from the relevant period, and photographed every identifying mark under 3 different lighting conditions. He did not share any of this with anyone in Millhaven because he had learned over the years that small towns have a particular appetite for other people's hopes, not to celebrate them, but to watch what happens when they fall. The first expert he contacted was a retired mechanical engineer in Cincinnati who had spent 20 years restoring vintage competition vehicles and was considered one of the most knowledgeable private historians of American racing hardware in the country. Logan drove up on a Saturday with the engine block covered in a canvas tarp and spent 2 hours in the man's workshop watching him circle the block without touching it, then touch it methodically for another hour, then sit at a workbench covered in reference photographs and say almost nothing for 40 minutes. Finally, the man whose name was Warren, 71 years old, a man who did not use imprecise language, looked up and said, "I cannot tell you with certainty what this is. What I can tell you is that it doesn't match any production component I have personally examined in 40 years of doing this work. That's not the same as saying it's significant, but it's also not the same as saying it isn't." The second contact was a technical historian named Dr. Patricia Holt at a university motorsport archive in Nashville, who had written her doctoral dissertation on suppressed American racing programs of the 1960s and 70s. Logan sent her the photographs and the partial identifier sequences along with his cross-comparison notes, and she called him back within 18 hours. Her voice had the measured quality of someone trying not to arrive at a conclusion faster than the evidence allowed. "The identifier sequence you've documented," she said carefully, "is consistent with the production notation system used by the Whitmore Group, which was the engineering consortium behind what historians typically refer to as the Apex program. I want to be clear, I am not confirming identification. What I am saying is that the sequence structure is not inconsistent with documentation from that program." She paused. If it is what the code suggests, the implications for automotive history are not small. Logan drove back to Millhaven and went directly to the garage. He had one more examination to perform. One he had been saving because some part of him understood that once he confirmed it, the story of his life would divide into 2 distinct periods, the before and the after. Beneath the crankcase skirt, slightly below the stamp he had already documented, he had noticed during his initial cleaning a faint rectangular impression in the aluminum surface, almost too subtle to register as intentional. He set up the jeweler's loop now, adjusted the bench light to its highest setting, and leaned in. The impression was a casting mark, a small geometric figure. A circle containing a stylized letter, A, with a horizontal line through the apex, the signature detail used internally by the Apex program on every prototype it ever produced. It was documented in exactly 2 known historical sources, both of which Logan had photocopied and clipped to his wall beside the workbench that same week. The mark was faint. It was unambiguous. And it was real. Logan set down the loop and sat on the rolling stool and did not move for a long time. He had come back to Millhaven at 28 to take care of a dying man, had given up a career and a future, had worked 6 days a week in a barely profitable garage for 6 years, while the town around him quietly decided he was going nowhere. And now, in his 34th year, in the cold gray light of his father's garage on the corner of Elm and 4th, he was looking at proof that he had pulled one of the most significant surviving artifacts of American motorsport history out of a pile of estate sale scrap for $400. He sat there and let himself feel, just for a moment, the full weight of what that meant. The information did not stay contained for long. Logan had been careful, but careful in a small town operates against a built-in informational gravity, and within 2 weeks of his initial consultation visits, the question of what Logan Carter had found in Ryan Foster's salvage yard had begun moving through the automotive collector community in a way that bore no resemblance to the quiet investigation he had intended. He had not posted anything publicly, had not spoken to anyone local, but Warren in Cincinnati had mentioned it in passing to a colleague, and that colleague had mentioned it to someone else, and the way information travels through specialist communities is faster and less controlled than the people inside them usually acknowledge. Ella Monroe was 29 years old and wrote for one of the most widely read automotive heritage publications in the country, a quarterly journal covering the intersection of mechanical history, collector culture, and the occasional disputed authentication story. She found Logan's garage on a Tuesday afternoon with a notepad on her passenger seat, and the particular energy of a journalist who has heard a story she cannot yet confirm but cannot stop thinking about. She knocked on the side door and introduced herself with professional directness, asking without excessive pressure whether Logan would be willing to speak on record. Logan was polite and firm. The authentication process was ongoing, and he had nothing to say for publication. Ella gave him her card without argument and left, though Logan noticed she sat in her rental car for several minutes before driving away, which told him she was thinking rather than defeated. The calls started the following week. The first was from a private collector in Charlotte who introduced himself as a serious buyer and offered $50,000 sight unseen, based purely on what he had heard through secondary channels. Logan thanked him and declined. 2 days later, a collecting syndicate from the Northeast called with an offer of $100,000, contingent on a 24-hour inspection window. Logan declined again. Then came a call from a brokerage firm specializing in motorsport heritage assets, representing an unnamed European client, with an offer of $250,000, no inspection required, immediate wire transfer. Full confidentiality. Logan ended the call after less than 2 minutes. The money was not the point. He had understood that from the moment he had seen the casting mark under the loop. What was sitting on his workbench was not an asset to be liquidated. It was a question that had been asked 60 years ago by engineers who pushed past the boundary of what was known and that had remained unanswered in a barn for decades while the world forgot to look for it. Logan was not going to answer a 60-year-old question with a phone call from a broker. The offers had not gone unnoticed in Millhaven, and by the second week, it was widely understood with the inflated certainty that characterizes small-town conversation that Logan Carter had found something worth serious money. Amelia heard about it from 2 separate sources on the same afternoon, both delivering the news with the tone of people who found it slightly more interesting than believable. She did not call Logan. She told herself she wasn't surprised, that something like luck could happen to anyone, that she wasn't sure she believed it was as significant as people were saying. But she noticed that she returned to the subject repeatedly over the following days, turning it over the way you turn over an idea you are trying to dismiss and cannot quite manage to put down. Then, on a Thursday evening, Logan's phone rang with a number he didn't recognize. The voice that greeted him when he answered was unhurried and measured, carrying the particular quality of calm that belongs to people who have spent many decades in situations where others lose their composure. "My name is Sebastian Hayes," the voice said. "I've been told you have something I've been looking for a very long time." I'd like to come and see it with my own eyes, if that's agreeable. Logan sat down slowly on the workbench stool. When, he said, Sebastian Hayes drove himself, which surprised Logan. He had expected a handler or an assistant. The entourage that wealth and reputation tend to generate automatically. Instead, a single dark blue pickup truck pulled into the garage lot on a Saturday morning, and the man who climbed out was 62 years old, lean in the way of someone who had stayed physically disciplined without making a performance of it, dressed in canvas work pants and a plain charcoal jacket bought for function rather than presentation. His face was weathered and precise, the face of someone who had spent decades in environments that demand attention, and his eyes, light, gray, and unhurried, moved over the exterior of the garage with the systematic assessment of a man who reads spaces before he enters them. Logan met him in the doorway. They shook hands without excess formality. Sebastian Hayes was a name known to everyone in the motorsport world. He had won 3 major endurance championships in his prime, and had subsequently built a second reputation as one of the most serious private collectors and preservationists of racing heritage machinery in North America. He was not a man who made impulsive journeys. The fact that he had driven 4 hours to a one-bay garage in Millhaven, Kentucky, told Logan everything he needed to know about how seriously the rumors had been received. Sebastian walked into the garage and paused at the threshold, taking in the space, the hydraulic lifts, the tool wall, the shelves of technical references, the workbench with its careful organization. He said nothing about the garage itself. He looked at the engine block on the workstand and then looked away, which Logan found more meaningful than if he had stared. He turned to Logan and said, "Tell me where you found it." Logan told him everything: Ryan Foster's lot, the estate delivery from Harlan County, the condition of the pile, the unusual geometry that had caught his attention, the $400 he had paid. He described the cleaning process, the alloy composition testing, the discovery of the secondary stamp, the visit to Warren in Cincinnati, the call with Doc Holt in Nashville, and the casting mark beneath the crankcase skirt. He spoke without embellishment, the way his father had taught him to describe a diagnostic finding with precision and without performance. Sebastian listened without interrupting. When Logan finished, Sebastian walked to the workstand and stood before the engine block, producing a small folding loop from his jacket pocket, which he extended and held to his eye, leaning over the block the way a jeweler leans over a stone. He worked in complete silence for what Logan estimated was 35 minutes, moving around the block in a slow circuit, examining surfaces that Logan himself had spent dozens of hours studying. The garage was quiet enough that the sound of traffic on Elm Street filtered in as background texture. When Sebastian finally straightened up and folded the loop back into his pocket, he was quiet for another long moment. Then he turned to Logan and looked at him with an expression that carried something Logan had not seen directed at him in a very long time, a kind of level, unhurried respect. "I drove routes through the Southeast for nearly 3 decades, Sebastian said. Estate sales, barn finds, private collections, demolition auctions. I had field researchers in 8 states for a period in the 90s. I came close twice, once in Tennessee, once in Virginia, and both times it was something else." He looked back at the engine block on the stand. "I had more or less concluded it was gone, that the fire in '71 had taken everything." He paused. Clearly it hadn't. Logan kept his voice level. "So it is what I think it is." Sebastian looked at him directly. "Do you know what you're holding?" he asked. It was not rhetorical. He wanted a specific answer. Logan thought carefully before he replied. "I know it's one of the surviving prototype units from the Apex program. I know the program produced fewer than 6 functional test units before it was shuttered, and that all of them were believed destroyed. I know that no confirmed survivor has ever been publicly documented." He paused. "Beyond that, I'd rather hear what you know," Sebastian looked at the engine for a long, quiet moment. When he spoke, his voice carried the quality of genuine emotion, held under careful control by someone who had a great deal of practice. The Apex program was the closest anyone came, before modern computational design, to solving the flat plane crankshaft balance problem in a large displacement application. He said, "The engineers involved were some of the most gifted mechanical minds of the 20th century, and most of them never received credit because the program died before it produced anything the public ever saw. This engine was their life's work, built by people who understood that the most important things are often the ones nobody remembers to look for." He stopped. "The fact that you found it in a salvage yard tells you something about how the world works." Logan sat down on the stool by the workbench. "The fact that you recognized it," Sebastian added quietly, "tells you something about you." The conversation that followed was long and technical and moved through its material the way the best conversations about mechanical things always do, with the unhurried quality of two people who understand that precision matters more than speed. Sebastian asked specific questions about the cleaning methodology, the condition of the crankshaft journals, the integrity of the cylinder bore surfaces, and Logan answered each one with the detail it deserved. By midday, they had gone through 2 rounds of coffee from the machine at the back of the garage, and the winter light coming through the high windows had shifted from gray to a flat, pale white. Then Sebastian set down his cup and looked at Logan with the directness that had characterized his entire visit. "I want to make you an offer," he said. "Before I tell you the number, I want to say something. I don't make offers as a negotiating position. When I say a number, it's because I believe that number is honest, and I'm going to explain why." He described what the Apex engine represented in the context of American racing history, not its monetary value, which he would address directly in a moment, but its place in the lineage of mechanical innovation. He talked about the engineers whose careers had been defined by this program and who had died without seeing their work recognized, about what proper preservation and documentation would mean to the historical record. And then he said, $1 million. Logan did not move. "Cash transaction. Full provenance documentation provided by my team. The engine remains in the United States, and it will be displayed and preserved in a manner consistent with its historical significance," Sebastian continued. "That's my starting position," Logan said. "I need to think." Sebastian nodded. "I expected that." The word of Sebastian Hayes's visit moved through the collector community with the speed of anything people have been waiting a long time to hear. By the following morning, 2 other serious buyers had made contact, one through Ella Monroe, who had somehow remained in the conversation's orbit, and one through a direct call to Ryan Foster, who had no idea what he had sold for $400 and spent 15 minutes on the phone with Logan in a state of barely coherent amazement. The second offer, transmitted through an intermediary, was $1.5 million. The third, from a European motorsport museum, was $2 million. Logan kept them all at arm's length. He called Sebastian Hayes, and they met again over dinner at the only sit-down restaurant in Millhaven that stayed open past 9, a place where the booths had worn vinyl and the coffee was excellent, and they talked for 3 hours about engines and history, and the nature of things that survive beyond their expected lifetimes. Amelia Brooks walked past the window at 9:45 in the evening and saw Logan sitting across from Sebastian Hayes in a booth, both men leaning forward with the posture of a conversation that mattered. She stopped walking. She stood outside in the cold for a moment and watched through the glass, then continued to her car and sat in the parking lot for a while with the engine running, and the particular feeling of someone who has just understood, very clearly, that they chose not to be in the future that was available to them. Inside the restaurant, Sebastian said, "I'm prepared to go to $2 million. I want you to have the number before other parties further complicate this." Logan looked at him across the table. "You have more room than that," Logan said, not as an accusation but as a statement of fact. Sebastian was quiet for a moment, then almost smiled. "I do," he said. "All right." He looked out the window briefly, then back. $4 million. Final offer. Because I think this engine deserves to be in the hands of someone who cares about what happens to it next. And I've done this long enough to know that the number has to reflect the significance, not just the scarcity. He paused. 4 million. And I want you credited as a contributor to the historical documentation, not as a consultant, but permanently. The restaurant was quiet around them. 2 tables away, an older couple ate pie without speaking, the comfortable silence of people who have been together long enough to not need to fill every moment with words. Logan looked at the table for a long time. Then he said, "I have one condition." Amelia called Logan 3 days later. Her voice had a different quality than it had carried at the salvage yard. The sharp social confidence was present, but sitting on top of something less comfortable, something she was clearly managing carefully. She asked if they could meet, not in a professional context, just to talk. Logan said yes without making her explain herself, because he understood what the call was and did not think she deserved to struggle toward it any more than necessary. They met at the park on 2nd Street, cold and nearly empty on a weekday afternoon, the bare trees casting thin shadows across the frozen grass. Amelia wore a good coat and careful makeup, and the expression of someone who has rehearsed an opening and is not entirely certain how it will be received. She began by talking about the salvage yard, how she regretted what she had said, how it had been thoughtless and unkind, how the laughter had been something she should have stopped rather than participated in. Her apology was genuine, she meant the words, was not simply performing them for strategic reasons, but there was something underneath it she could not quite hide, which was the awareness that she was apologizing, not only for the salvage yard, but for a larger pattern that the salvage yard had merely summarized. Logan listened without interrupting. He had spent enough time with his own thoughts over the past several years to know the difference between the silence that crowds out what someone is trying to say and the silence that gives it room, and he offered the second kind. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment, looking at the frozen ground. "You don't have to apologize for the engine," he said. "That was always mine, regardless of whether you believed in it or not." Amelia looked at him. "I'm not just apologizing for the engine." "I know," he said. She was quiet for a moment. "I thought you needed to be going somewhere visible to be worth something," she said. "I was measuring you against a template that had nothing to do with who you actually were." She pulled her coat tighter. "I was wrong, not just about the engine." Logan looked at her without anger, which was the thing she found most difficult, not because she wanted him to be angry, but because the absence of anger revealed something about him that she had not fully understood when she was with him. He had not been passive or resigned when she left. He had simply been unreachable by the kind of approval she had been distributing. "You didn't see the wrong person," he said. "You just didn't see who the person was." He said it without accusation, the way you state a mechanical fact not to wound, but because precision matters more than comfort. "I was always going to be someone who spent his mornings in a garage and his evenings reading about engines. That's not a phase. That's not a failure to reach potential." He paused. "You wanted something different. That's not wrong." Amelia looked at him for a long moment, and something in her face shifted, not breaking exactly, but settling, the way a structure settles when the load it has been bearing is finally redistributed correctly. "I'm glad it worked out for you," she said, and she meant it. "So am I," Logan said. He meant that too. They stood in the cold park for another few minutes without speaking, which was not uncomfortable, but was honest in the way that two people can be honest with each other when they have both given up the performance of something that no longer applies. Then Amelia said goodbye and walked back to her car, and Logan stood under the bare trees for a little while longer, his hands in his jacket pockets, watching the pale winter sky above the rooftops of Millhaven. He did not feel triumph. He did not feel relief in the way you feel it when a threat passes. He felt something quieter and more durable, the settled clarity of a man who had known who he was for a long time, standing in a room that had recently gotten better lighting. The decision was not as simple as the number made it appear. Logan sat with it for several days after the dinner with Sebastian, returning to the garage in the mornings and standing before the engine block, and asking himself the question that had no strategic answer. What do you do with something like this? Given everything it cost you to find it? The case for keeping it was not about money. He could have held the engine for years, watched it appreciate further in both monetary and historical value, potentially become its permanent custodian in a way that carried its own kind of recognition. The case against was harder to articulate. The engine had been designed to be studied, understood, and preserved in a context where scholars and engineers and historians could engage with it, not stored in a one-bay garage in Millhaven because its owner wanted to feel significant. Logan had enough self-knowledge to recognize the difference between stewardship and possession. He drove to the cemetery one evening after closing the garage and sat for a while at his father's headstone, which was simple and gray, and said what it needed to say without elaboration. Raymond Carter, it read, and the dates, and below them the single line Logan had chosen. He taught his hands to listen. Logan sat in the cold and described what had happened, the way he had always talked to Raymond about mechanical problems, laying it out clearly. Without asking for a resolution, just letting the thinking happen in the presence of someone who had understood that kind of thinking. His father had never measured success by what a man possessed. He had measured it by whether a man could stand in front of his own work at the end of a day and know that he had done it honestly. The next morning, Logan called Sebastian. "I'll accept," he said. "4 million. But there's one condition, and it's not negotiable." Sebastian said, "Go ahead." In the official provenance documentation, the archival record, the preservation filing, everything your team produces, I want my father's name included. Raymond Carter. He taught me everything that made it possible to find this engine and know what I was looking at. If this engine goes into the historical record, his name goes with it. There was a short silence on the other end. Then Sebastian said, "That's not a condition. That's a requirement. I should have suggested myself. I'll make it permanent." Logan said, "Then, we have a deal." He walked back into the garage after the call and stood in front of the engine on the workstand for a long time. It was the same engine it had been when he had pulled it out of Ryan Foster's lot, the same engine that Amelia had looked at with the satisfied certainty of someone confirming a long-held opinion. It had not changed. What had changed was the frame around it, the history that had been cleaned off its surface, the significance that had been restored to legibility, the way that time and patience and a particular kind of knowledge can turn what everyone else calls worthless into what it actually is. He ran one hand along the cylinder head surface, the alloy that was wrong in all the right ways, the casting built by people who cared about precision more than credit, the engine that had waited in the dark for 60 years, to be found by someone who would know what to do with it. He thought about those engineers. He thought about his father. He let himself feel, without apology, that he had done something worthy of both. The paperwork took 6 weeks, faster than Logan had expected, a reflection of Sebastian Hayes's organizational thoroughness, and the fact that heritage transactions of this significance benefit from teams who know exactly what they are doing. The wire transfer arrived on a Tuesday morning, and Logan sat in the garage and looked at the notification on his phone for a long time before he moved on with his day. He did not buy a new house. He did not buy a new car, or take a vacation somewhere expensive, or change the way he dressed, or the diner where he had breakfast on weekday mornings. He repaired the garage. He had the hydraulic lifts properly rebuilt and calibrated, installed a new compressed air system, and added a third service bay to the structure by expanding into an adjacent storage building he had owned for years and never found a use for. He invested in a complete machine shop setup he had been wanting for more than a decade, a full-service lathe, a precision milling table, complete measuring equipment, the kind of serious tooling that transforms a service garage into a place where real restoration work can happen. He hired 2 mechanics, both of them recent graduates of the technical college in the next county over, young men who were good with their hands and needed someone to show them that competence was its own form of ambition. Ella Monroe published the story in the spring issue of her journal, and it was the most read piece the publication had produced in its 22-year history. The article covered the history of the Apex program, the circumstances of the engine's disappearance, and the improbable chain of events that had ended with Logan Carter cleaning a $400 salvage yard find and discovering, beneath 40 years of grime, one of the most historically significant surviving artifacts of American motorsport. The article mentioned Raymond Carter by name and included a photograph of the small plaque that Sebastian Hayes had commissioned to accompany the engine in its permanent installation at his preservation facility. A plaque that read, in part, "Engine identified and authenticated by Logan Carter of Millhaven, Kentucky. Following principles of careful mechanical attention, taught to him by his father, Raymond Carter." Amelia Brooks saw the article. She saw the photographs of the renovated garage, the new sign above the door, the line of vehicles waiting in the lot on a Saturday morning. She had moved to a city 3 hours away the previous year and was doing well by the metrics she had always applied to her own life. She sat with the article for a long time that morning and read the quote Logan had given Ella near the end of the piece, which was characteristically brief and precise. "I wasn't trying to prove anything. I just trusted what I knew and stayed with it." She closed the journal and set it on the counter in her kitchen. The feeling she sat with was not jealousy, and it was not regret in the simple sense of wishing she had made different decisions. It was something more specific, the recognition that she had once been close enough to see who Logan Carter actually was, had mistaken his stillness for stagnation and his patience for lack of ambition, and had walked away from someone who was quietly one of the most remarkable people she had ever stood next to. The money was simply the world's way of confirming what had always been true. On a morning in early April, Logan opened the garage at 7, made a pot of coffee, and stood in the third bay looking at a 1968 competition coupe that had been trucked in the previous week for full mechanical restoration, the kind of work he had been born to do, the kind of problem that demanded everything he knew and paid him back in the currency of things understood. His father's photograph was mounted on the wall above the workbench, the same small frame it had always been in. His phone rang. He looked at the screen. Ryan Foster. "Logan," Ryan said, already laughing before he had finished the word. "You are not going to believe what just came in." Logan looked at the photograph on the wall. He felt the particular warmth that belongs to a life that has finally grown large enough to match the person living it. He set his coffee down. "I'll be right there," he said. There is a version of Logan Carter's story that could be reduced to luck, a man in the right place at the right time, an accidental fortune extracted from a pile of junk. That version is easier to believe because it requires nothing from the people who hear it. It puts the outcome beyond reach, and the man outside the pattern of any life you might recognize. But that is not the story. The story is that Logan Carter spent 20 years learning to listen to metal. He sacrificed a career to honor a relationship that mattered more to him than advancement. He worked in obscurity without performing suffering or demanding recognition. He built knowledge slowly and without an audience. And when the moment arrived that made that knowledge matter, he was ready not by accident, but by practice, not by luck, but by the sustained choice to remain curious in the presence of things other people had given up on. The world is full of engines left in the dark, waiting for someone who knows how to read them. Most people walk past. Every once in a while, someone stops, kneels down, and looks again, and discovers that what everyone else had written off was, in fact, the most significant thing in the room. That is not a story about money. That is a story about the kind of person who never confused being overlooked with being wrong, and who had the patience to let the truth speak for itself.